Welcome back. It's an exciting day because we're wrapping up our discussion of Wayne Booth's The Rhetoric of Fiction, and we've got some pretty cool stuff to talk about today. Obviously, the best way to catch up for today's video is to watch the two that came before it. You know where to find them. But it's worth reviewing where we've been already before we start diving into the new stuff. So in part 1, we talked about Booth's argument that modern fiction has been governed by rules that are designed to make the author practically invisible in their own work. Booth suggests that those rules don't do much, though, to ensure that anyone will actually write quality fiction. In fact, they serve to limit the rhetorical techniques that are available to writers. And in part 2, Booth talks about the rhetorical benefits that can come through direct author commentary and through the use of narrators in order to show that it's not all bad. Direct commentary can prevent confusion, and narrators can enrich a reader's experience of a story in a way that can't otherwise be achieved. In part 3, then, Booth concludes his Rhetoric of Fiction by walking through the effects of authorial silence and also discussing the larger implications of any storytelling choice that an author may make. It's good stuff, so let's get right into it. As Booth begins to talk about fiction where the author remains silent, he also points out once again that the author can never entirely disappear. He says, "They do not speak, that is, directly. The author's voice is still dominant in a dialogue that is at the heart of all experience with fiction. With commentary ruled out, hundreds of devices remain for revealing judgment and molding responses." Booth goes on to list many of the tools that are available to silent authors in order to help them to shape the story and readers' perceptions of what's going on. Things like drawing attention to specific details, controlling the pacing of events in the story, or selecting certain things to portray more or less dramatically. Even when the author isn't speaking, their presence, of course, can still be felt. And there are some real benefits to be gained when the author decides not to play such a prominent role in their own story. For example, an author who steps into the background to let a narrator tell a story or to let the characters work things out themselves creates an opportunity for readers to become more emotionally invested in the stories that they're reading. Instead of hearing about the events from an objective third party, readers hear about the story from characters who are directly involved in it, and that pulls them into the drama in a way that author commentary would have a really hard time doing. Authors can also control how clear or confusing the facts of a story are based on how much they participate in the story directly. When the author's voice is front and center, it's pretty obvious what is true and what isn't. But when an author lets things play out through characters or unreliable narrators, it can be harder to pin down the truth, and that sense of mystery or uncertainty can at times be something that's really desirable. And Booth points out that we can find a certain kind of pleasure in the unspoken bond between a reader and a silent author. We might like the fact that somebody has put together a puzzle for us to decipher, as in the case of a mystery novel. Or we might like the feeling of collaborating or colluding with the author as the story unfolds. The author knows what's going on, and we know what's going on, but the characters don't, and we may genuinely enjoy being in on that secret as we watch things unfold. So, while Booth generally challenges the rule that authors should always be absent from the stories that they tell, he does acknowledge that there are some legitimate benefits to be had when authors fade into the background. As he writes, by the kind of silence he maintains, by the manner in which he leaves his characters to work out their own destinies or tell their own stories, the author can achieve effects which would be difficult or impossible if he allowed himself or a reliable spokesman to speak directly and authoritatively to us. Of course, as he has before, Booth makes it clear that authorial silence is not always beneficial or desirable. So while there may be instances where the author wants to play a less direct role in the story that they're telling, adhering to the rule that authors should always hide will end up compromising some stories more than it might improve them. And the primary pitfall of authorial silence is confusion. Without the ability to rely on the absolute truth of author commentary, readers are left to their best guess. And as we've talked about before, whenever readers have the opportunity to misunderstand something that we write, we can be sure that there will always be at least a few who do. So when we mindlessly follow the rule that authors should be silent and that we should always show rather than tell, we run a pretty high risk of confusing our readers past the point of no return. We may unintentionally leave our readers to deal with too much complexity or subtlety, and that will leave them wide open to miss the story that we're actually trying to tell. That's why, in discussing a particular story with a silent author, Booth says some literary failures show themselves by producing the same result in all readers. Boredom, disgust, or whatever, but from the nature of this story, it follows that the direction of the failure will show itself differently in different readers. He then says, one of the worst results of all this is that it becomes more and more difficult to rely in our criticism on the old standards of proof. Evidence from the book can never be decisive. A lot of the time, we may think we're being artsy or profound by leaving our work wide open to a variety of possible interpretations. But the fact is, we're probably just confusing our readers and making it impossible for them to understand what we're actually trying to tell them. Obviously, it's not a good thing when we've completely stumped our readers. But there's a more dangerous pitfall to authorial silence too. When authors stay out of their own stories, they run the risk of appearing to endorse their characters' bad behavior. As Booth puts it, objective narration, particularly when conducted through a highly unreliable narrator, offers special temptations to the reader to go astray. Even when it presents characters whose conduct the author deeply deplores, it presents them through the seductive medium of their own self-defending rhetoric. It is consequently not surprising that reactions to such works have been marked with confusion and false accusations. That is, silent authors not only can create confusion about the facts of a story, but they can also create confusion about the morality of a story. An author who thoughtlessly shows the story of a deplorable character without ever taking a moment to tell the reader that that character is in fact deplorable may generate more sympathy for that awful character than was originally intended. And that might inadvertently lead to readers becoming more tolerant of attitudes or behaviors that are far from admirable, or it might lead to the accusation that the author in fact endorses something deplorable, and thus a misunderstanding that has arisen only in the name of artsiness spells the end of an author's career. So it's clear that a rhetorical understanding of fiction moves us beyond the basic best practices for writing and pushes us towards a deeper consideration of the morality of fiction and of the choices that we make as we write. And that then leads us to Booth's final step in his project. In the final chapter of the book, Booth writes, if writing well were simply creating a well-turned phrase, the statement could mean only that. But when we say that the morality in art rests in writing well, we silently import into our claim the concept of the realization of a worthwhile purpose. And that really gets to the heart of what Booth means when he talks about the morality of fiction. For Booth, it has much less to do with whether or not a story adheres to a particular moral code, and much more to do with whether a story offers a worthwhile use of a reader's time. Throughout the book, Booth draws our attention to the reality that writers have a lot more choices than the rules would lead us to believe, and each choice has implications for the ways that readers will understand our stories, relate to our characters, and perceive us as authors. No choice is neutral, so rather than relying on the rules to make those choices for us, Booth argues that we ought to know what choices are available to us as we write, and what the consequences of those choices might be. Ultimately, Booth argues, authors have the primary moral responsibility of establishing a good relationship with their readers. As he explains, the writer should worry less about whether his narrators are realistic than about whether the image he creates of himself, his implied author, is one that his readers can admire. Nothing will so certainly consign a work to ultimate oblivion as an implied author who detests his readers or who thinks that his work is better than it is. So whether you choose to participate actively in your story through direct author commentary, or you prefer to let a narrator do all the talking, just know that there isn't one choice that is inherently better than all the rest. In any case, the best choice will be the one that enables you to establish a good relationship with your readers so that you can tell a worthwhile story as clearly and engagingly as possible. So we certainly have covered a lot in these past few videos, and it is of course only a fraction of everything that Booth discusses in nearly 400 pages of print. It wouldn't have been possible for us to talk about everything that he says, so I wanted to focus instead on the things that could help you to write better stories, and I hope that you've heard something useful along the way. And if you want to know more about the rhetoric of fiction, there's of course plenty more to learn in the book itself. Track down a copy and see what you can find out. Our discussions here should help you to start off on the right foot. Of course, I'd be remiss not to express my thanks to those of you who suggested that we talk about this book in the first place. It's always great to know what you want to see more of on the channel, so please keep those recommendations coming. Plus, you know, I read this book way more carefully to prepare these videos than I ever did to prepare for my exams, so I guess I should thank you for that too. Now, to end, here's one more quotation from the book. If an author wants to earn the reader's confusion, then unreliable narration may help him. On the other hand, if a work requires an effect like intense dramatic irony, whether comic or tragic, the author may find new uses for direct, reliable narration. Let each work do what it wants to do. Let its author discover its inherent powers and gauge his techniques to the realization of those powers. It's a great reminder of what I wish everyone knew about writing. It's just not about the rules. Really, it's about knowing your options and then adjusting your writing to fit your purpose. And on that note, I hope that our discussions of the rhetoric of fiction have earned your like. If they have, I also invite you to subscribe so that you'll be ready to join us on our next rhetorical adventures. As always, share your questions and responses in the comments, and consider sharing this video with someone whose fiction could maybe use a little rhetorical boost. I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, though, go use your authorial powers for good.